The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start. The proceeding will start shortly. Proceeding will start shortly. Start shortly.
Question to the Secretary of State of the Home Department. I call the Home Secretary to answer question 1 from Neil Coyle, who is participating virtually. Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group question 1 and 2 together. Domestic abuse devastates lives, and especially at the time that we've all experienced with COVID, victims are particularly vulnerable. And as we know, home has not been a safe place for everyone to access the usual support that they could receive. And that is why, through the work of our landmark domestic abuse bill, we are committed to protecting victims in a stronger way.
Let's head over to see Neil Coyle in Bermondsey. Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As things stand, the government is discriminating against people who have no recourse to public funds restrictions imposed on them and their British-born children they are denied access to support. Will the Home Secretary end this discrimination by amending the domestic abuse bill to ensure help is provided to everyone affected by domestic violence and scrap this fundamentally racist policy?
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I say to the honourable gentleman, first of all, the domestic abuse bill was discussed, and in fact, I think it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, has been discussed extensively in this House, and I actually want to thank everybody that's made outstanding contributions, including many of the organisations that participated in advance of the bill coming to the House of Commons itself. We are offering support to migrants who suffer domestic abuse through our Destitute Domestic Violence violence concession scheme. But also, I would like to emphasise to the honourable gentleman, and he will know this from his own work as a Member of Parliament and with local authorities and the support that is provided by local authorities too, that of course people, individuals can access both safe accommodation and get support through various means, and that is incredibly important, Mr. Speaker.
David Simmons.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, does she agree that children who are often the hidden victims of domestic violence, either as victims themselves or through witnessing it amongst parents and other members of the household, are going to gain additional protection from our landmark domestic abuse bill?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and this is an important issue in terms of children and the protection of children. Children are victims when it comes to domestic abuse, and it is a sad fact that children often witness some of the most abhorrent abuse of their parent or of others as well. And of course the bill does exactly that. And in fact, I'm really pleased, very proud that we have made sure that children are absolutely at the heart of this bill. It's right that we safeguard and it's right that we protect them.
Shadow Minister Jester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Between 2015 and 2019, despite domestic violence cases rising by 77%, charging fell by 18% and conviction by 20%. In 2018-19, there were almost 60,000 reports of rape to the police, but less than 1,800 were charged and less than 1,000 convicted. The number of cases of rape referred by the police for charging decisions fell by 32% in 2019. How does the Secretary of State account for her government's performance in the falling rates of charge and conviction in sexual and domestic violence?
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that extensive work has been undertaken across government, and not just recently, but in previous years as well. I'm absolutely committed, as is my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, to ensure that we take an end-to-end approach to this through our work, through the Royal Commission that we're establishing on the criminal justice system, and also to make sure that so much more work is undertaken within policing to make sure that charges are undertaken, making sure as well that the right kind of effective training is put in place with police forces and police officers. I've been very clear about that through all my work in policing, as has the policing minister. But ultimately, of course, charging itself and getting those cases to court has to be the priority, which is why the Home Office is working in the right approach, in the right way, with the criminal justice system and the Lord Chancellor.
Anderson.
Number 4, please, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I would like to group question 4 and question 5. We are ending free movement and will introduce a new, firmer, fairer, skills-led global immigration system, with further details of it published today. Last month, our immigration bill passed through this House unamended, despite the best efforts of the Labour Party and the separatist benches.
Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the people of Ashfield, I fully support this government in introducing a points-based immigration system. For far too long, freedom of movement has encouraged the exploitation of migrant labour, which has driven down wages, increased pressure on public services and had a significant impact on housing in places like Ashfield. Could my right honourable friend please assure me that moving forward, this government will implement a firm but fair points-based system attracting high-skilled workers whilst also prioritising British jobs for British people?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. The points-based system will support our wider economic strategy by encouraging investment in the domestic UK workforce, whilst ensuring businesses can still attract the brightest and the best from around the world to Ashfield. We want employers to focus on training and investing in our domestic workforce, driving productivity and improving opportunities for resident workers, with immigration policy being part of, not an alternative, to our strategy for the UK labour market.
Mark Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The introduction of the points-based immigration system is a pledge that we gave the British people and one that we are now delivering on. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that now is the time also for employers to create the working conditions for our homegrown population to be attracted to the work that these employers should be offering as well? Thank you.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Under our new points-based immigration system, the UK, especially the Black Country, will continue to be open to the best talent from around the world. But it is right, employers should always be looking to recruit from the domestic workforce first and ensure they offer terms and conditions, plus career development opportunities, which make this possible, especially as we look to support those who have suffered the economic effects of COVID-19 back into work.
We now come to Rachel Hopkins with her substantive.
Number 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to group this question with nearly every other question on the order paper. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12, please, sir. The government is now spending over £15,000 million on policing, an increase of £1 billion on last year, with £700 million being allocated to police and crime commissions to recruit 6,000 additional officers by the end of March 2021. While there's no direct connection between police numbers and crime, this will give them the capacity to be much more agile in the face of changing crime.
Rachel Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, in Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary's recent annual assessment of policing, he stated that policing and some other public services are closely linked, and that the level of investment in one public service will have an effect, good or bad, on another, and referenced health, particularly mental health, drug and alcohol services, housing, social services as examples. So can the Minister confirm what assessment he has made of the huge detrimental impact that COVID-19 has made on local authorities responsible for these services, and the fact that many local councils, including Luton Council in my constituency, are being forced into making significant in-year budget cuts, and thus its impact on local policing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is quite right to draw the connections between policing and other services in the public sector, but I can't speak to the resilience or otherwise of the finances of her particular local authority. What I can say is that the Prime Minister has tasked me and the Home Secretary with the job of driving cross-government working to deal with some of those causal factors to crime beyond enforcement, and we will be talking to local authorities across the country about the part they can play. Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Money for additional police officers is welcomed across the board, even though it doesn't take police numbers back to pre-2010 levels. But can I ask the Minister, surely he would acknowledge that baseline budgets in police forces have been cut again this year, and capital funding is almost non-existent. So surely, unless the Secretary of State is able to win more money for policing generally, forces will be unable to afford to keep the officers they've got.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is obviously a cup-half-empty person, rather than a cup nearly three-quarters full, and the biggest settlement for policing in a decade should be welcomed by everybody across this House, as it has been across the whole of the policing family. But that's not to say policing isn't without challenges and that it can't be more efficient. And while we do want to see more police officers and a better response to crime, there's always the challenge in public service to do things better for less.
Let's head up and see Rosie Cooper in lovely Lancashire. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lancashire has been allocated a funding of £4.3 million to deliver the additional 153 police officers by the end of this financial year. But that award reflects a part-year cost, as 153 officers can't be employed for the whole year, as that cost is £9.8 million. So will the Secretary of State commit to providing the funding in 21-22, the full funding, and for future years to sustain these additional officers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is perhaps confusing her figures, shall we say. Lancashire Police received £22.6 million increase in funding this year, which will allow them to recruit another 153 police officers over the next 12 months, less than 12 months now, up to March next year. They're making good progress and have recruited 66 already.
Let's head across the world. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, coastal communities like West Kirby and Caldy in my constituency have seen huge numbers of visitors in search of relaxation and exercise. This has placed additional strain on Merseyside Police, who've been working hard to respond to the concerns of local residents about crowds on beaches and in parks. Merseyside Police estimate that the cost of the pandemic to date is £4.1 million due to overtime, the cost of PPE, specialist cleaning and lost income. So will the Minister give assurance that Merseyside Police will be reimbursed for these costs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've had a number of telephone conversations with the Chief Constable of Merseyside Police over the last few weeks and months, as has my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and I'm pleased to say that that force is in good heart, as far as we can tell. Happily, they are running well in advance of their recruitment allocation, and I'm told at the end of March they've recruited 220 police officers against an allocation of 200, which does give them extra capacity to deal with the problems that she has outlined. Notwithstanding that fact, there are obviously extra costs for policing in COVID-19, and we're in conversation with the Treasury about how we might address them.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the excellent announcement that my right honourable friend has given the House this afternoon, which goes a long way towards meeting our Conservative Party pledge to recruit an extra 20,000 police officers, would he agree that the real importance of those police officers is that every criminal will know that it's much more likely that their crime is going to be investigated, and if it's proved, will result in a prosecution?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, with his usual perspicacity, the honourable member puts his finger on their button. We know that the greatest deterrent of crime is the perception of the likelihood of being caught. And the fact that Gloucestershire Police have now more than recruited their annual allocation of police officers, he'll be pleased to hear 48 over 46 already so far this year, means that that is much more likely to be the case in his county.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Suffolk Constabulary are one of the lowest funded forces from central government, have made significant efficiency savings and have increased council tax by over 25% in 3 years. Can my right honourable friend, the Minister, confirm that the review of the grant funding formula is still going ahead in the next few months, as this is vital to the future of policing in Suffolk?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is a doughty champion for his constituency in his county, and I understand his impatience and his desire to battle for their financial interests, as I did as a backbencher for Hampshire as well. We have, both the Home Secretary and I, said in public in the past that the funding formula, while it's the only formula we've got at the moment, is a bit old-fashioned, probably needs a look at, and as part of our vision for policing in the future, no doubt we will get to it in time.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister join me in praising Nottinghamshire Police, who have acted so quickly to recruit more officers that they are 12 months ahead of the government's recruitment target and were the first force to introduce police officer degree apprenticeships? And does he agree with me that forces like Nottinghamshire, which are leading the way and which have also increased their diversity, should be first in line for any additional government funding?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very heartening to see that as one of her priorities as a new member in this House is to stand with and defend her local police, and she's quite right to do so. And I join her in offering our thanks and praise to them for the work they've done. And in fact, I was able to do so in person because I was on the phone with her Chief Constable just this morning. She's quite right that Nottinghamshire is a forward-looking police force, and we will be supporting them in their endeavours to innovate and challenge crime in the months to come.
Shadow Minister Surcharge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the one hand, the Prime Minister has hailed an end to austerity and promised 20,000 new frontline police officers. On the other, we have alarming reports at the weekend of forces facing up to 15% cuts. COVID, on top of 10 years of austerity, has created a perfect storm for police funding. Lower council tax coming in, costs of PPE, lower income from some of their sources like airports and large events. And I have heard from multiple sources that essential staff jobs will have to be cut, meaning that frontline police officers will end up covering non-frontline roles, completely the opposite of what the Prime Minister intends. One senior police officer said to me this morning, this looks like austerity by the back door. Can the Minister commit today to plugging the funding gap from council precepts to guarantee there won't be a need to cut police staff?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, on a technical front, I think the Honourable Lady perhaps misunderstands how the precept worked, in that the primary liability, if you like, is covered by the precepting authority, which has by law to pass on the precept in full, notwithstanding any issues that it might have with collection. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, alongside her many skills, she's acquired telepathy and foresight, because she seems to be preempting a spending review which hasn't even started.
Right, we now come to a substantive question from Mark Logan to the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group this with question 15 and 16. We are, as we've already discussed, Mr. Speaker, in the process of recruiting an extra 20,000 police officers to put violent criminals behind bars, and already I can announce, Mr. Speaker, that already we have recruited over 3,000 of those officers, and we will continue to ensure that we back the police and ensure that we will deliver on higher police numbers.
We now wander up to see Mark Logan in Bolton. Mark Logan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And speeding complaints are well and truly up in Bolton North East. All this fast is making my constituents furious. The day I took part in a community speed watch on Ainsworth Lane, 74 miles per hour was recorded in a 20-mile-an-hour zone. The problem is particularly severe on Blackburn, Halliwell and Turton roads. Many of these 20-mile-an-hour areas are located near schools, yet the speed limit is not enforced. Does the Secretary of State agree that regulations should be introduced to ensure speed limits are adhered to and close a very dangerous loophole to keep my residents safe and put an end to the Fast and Furious sequels?
Mr. Speaker, I actually agree with the Honourable Gentleman about the devastating impact that speeding can have on lives and on communities, and he is right to highlight the irresponsible speeds that are being driven, particularly in residential areas near schools. We do not plan to legislate, but of course he will know very specifically police enforcement around speeding is very much a matter for the police authority itself, and I'll be very happy to work with him if he has particular issues or concerns that he would like me to pick up.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I bounced in here this afternoon ready to sing the praises of Thames Valley Police Force for their positive recruitment campaign ahead of schedule to meet their officers' targets. But it seems that this isn't new news, because all of the other members on these benches are similarly pleased with their local forces for meeting their police targets and getting those officers' numbers up. So perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary will join me instead in praising especially the Thames Valley Police in Milton Keynes for keeping our rural communities and our city centre communities safe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my honourable friend for his enthusiasm, his gusto, and actually his support for Thames Valley Police. I will just share with the House, I've got a very, very fond spot for Thames Valley Police. They're one of the first police forces that I visited when I became Home Secretary. And I visited them, Mr. Speaker, because of a devastating event that took place, and that was a death of a police officer, which was tragic. And I commend the Chief Constable, John Campbell, the officers. They are an impressive police force, they really are. They police a very significant geography, and quite frankly, they are the best of us all, and he's absolutely right to commend them for the work that they do.
Christian Wade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Getting more officers onto our streets is one of the people's priorities, and I know that is why my right honourable friend is committed to recruiting 20,000 over the next 3 years. But can my right honourable friend confirm how many have been recruited in Greater Manchester, and can she also ensure my constituents that they are fully equipped to tackle crime and keep our streets safe?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question and his dedication and support as well, both to policing locally, but to his constituents in terms of wanting to keep them safe. That is absolutely right. And I can confirm, in terms of recruitment locally across Greater Manchester, I do commend his Chief Constable as well. As of the end of March, Greater Manchester Police had recruited an additional 94 officers towards the year allocation. I can confirm that number is going up and up. And Mr. Speaker, you may also be interested to know that since our campaign started, we have had over 70,000 applicants to become police officers. That is something we should be proud of, because policing is an incredible profession.
Alan Kearns.
Number 17, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to group this question, Mr. Speaker, with number 18. The Home Office has been working every single day with the National Police Chief Council throughout the COVID crisis. And of course, we've been working with them to back the police when it comes to law enforcement, but equally importantly, ensuring that they are resourced throughout COVID to provide the support that is required for frontline police officers.
Mr. Speaker, during this COVID period, many coastal communities have found themselves under threat from mass gatherings. In my constituency, Ōgmo by Sea is one example and Barry Island is another. will my right honourable friend join me in sending the strongest message that such behaviour will not be tolerated, and will she further support the police and pay tribute to them for the strong action they're taking in ensuring that the coastal communities can be enjoyed by families and by tourists who want to visit and enjoy the fantastic resource we have?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I have visited his constituency in the past. I know what a beautiful constituency it is, and I do want to commend the officers and the police chief for all the work that they have been doing. And he's right to want that area protected for local residents, for it to be enjoyed in a responsible way. And of course, there is no scope for antisocial behaviour at all. And we want to make sure, and we have been continuing to support the police to make sure that they've been equipped throughout this COVID crisis to police effectively and encourage the right and responsible kinds of behaviours.
Lady Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the investment made by the Devon and Cornwall Police and Crime Commissioner Alison Hernandez just last week to provide an additional £500,000 in emergency funding to 20 tourism hotspots in our 2 counties, including 2 in my North Devon constituency, to help prevent alcohol-related antisocial behaviour following the lifting of lockdown, and commit to looking at how such additional COVID-related costs can be supported by the government?
My friend is absolutely right, and I commend everybody locally for the fantastic work that they've been doing across policing, and of course her Police and Crime Commissioner and the Honourable Member as well. She's right to raise the additional costs of COVID. In fact, my Honourable friend, the Police Minister, has already touched on the fact that we are in discussions with the Treasury. It is inevitable that extra costs have arisen, whether it's through PPE or additional time and hours that police officers have been given. That is ongoing, but at this particular point, Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend everybody for the great work that they've been doing throughout this crisis.
Minister Conor again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I fully agree with the Home Secretary in supporting the work that the police do to maintain public order. But I can't help but feel, Mr. Speaker, that the Home Secretary talks a good game, but we haven't seen much evidence of action, because we've seen a marked decline in the number of public order trained officers and police support units on this government's watch, and the recruitment that she talks about simply won't replace those and does take a lot of time. So can the Home Secretary tell us what she's doing now, today, to support Chief Constables in dealing with these pressures and to ensure our frontline officers have the proper resources and the training they need?
Well, it's absolutely right that through the recruitment and the investment that this government is putting into policing, the largest ever policing fund and settlement, certainly for the last decade, over £1 billion, it is... No, I have not sacked them all, to be quite frank. No. Mr. Speaker, our investment in policing is the largest investment in over a decade, and that is something that every single police chief around the country is supporting. And I think the honourable gentleman should take stock of the fact that when he speaks to police chiefs, as I do every single day, as my honourable friend the Police Minister does every single day, that they welcome the investment in new officers, but also the training. The fact of the matter is the money that has been put into invest in new officers also covers the training, a wide range of training. That's training that has gone into the National College of Policing. That's training and investment in the professional development. It's taking place now in the professional development of our police officers. That is something we should all be proud of.
Right. 20 not here, so I'm going straight on to Rishna Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 21.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I would like to group this question with questions 22 and 23. Home Office and Department of Health and Social Care officials are working to implement the surcharge exemption. The Home Office is currently identifying all those on a Tier 2 visa who will benefit from a refund, and these payments have already started. Those eligible to apply for the new health and care visa will be exempt from the immigration health surcharge.
I thank the Minister for his answer, but the fact that migrant workers in the NHS and care sector have had to pay the surcharge in the first place is an insult to their sacrifices. And the fact that the government is taking so long to implement the promise that the Prime Minister made is an added insult. Can I ask the Minister, How many people have actually now got the exemption, and how many are left to receive it?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, when the honourable member refers to how long, in my answer I already said refund payments have already started, and we are imminent to implement the new health and care visa, which will see those under it exempt. So work is continuing, and to be clear, the health surcharge is about creating resources for the NHS and has supported the NHS, but we've announced this policy and we're driving it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Mr. Speaker will know, the Ilford South is a very diverse constituency. 60% of my local population come from either the heritage or directly, from immigrant communities. The Oxford University done a study just last year that said 25 billion between 2001 and 2011 was a net fiscal giving to our country's economy. So one thing that people in Ilford South are wondering is whether or not the Minister agrees that the policy that the government had acted so slowly to move forward was not only wrong, but that the government should offer an apology to people in Ilford South working in our NHS who are fearful, risking their lives and not getting the support they deserve from the government.
Well, I think the people of Ilford South working with the NHS will have been pleased to see the measures that we've taken, and not least the fact that we will look to prioritise those coming to work for the NHS under our new visa system.
Sarah Sultan.
Mr. Speaker, key workers kept our country running through the crisis, from doctors and nurses to supermarket assistants and delivery drivers. That's why we clap for them, and they all pay their taxes. They all contribute to the NHS. That's why the NHS surcharge is a discriminatory double tax on migrants. So since the government acknowledges that it's wrong to clap for nurses one day and charge them extra the next, will the Minister extend this principle to all workers and scrap the immigration health surcharge for all?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd probably contrast some of those comments with the comments we got on the immigration health surcharge from the Labour Party during the Bill Committee. But in terms of where this is, we're clear that our NHS offers fantastic, free at point of need care and services, and it's not unreasonable to ask those who come to this country to make a contribution towards it until they achieve ILR in settlement, which means that reflecting a long-term commitment to this country, which then means they're exempt from it.
Shadow Minister Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Further to the excellent questions already asked, Dr. Sadara is just one of the hundreds of clinicians who's already had to pay the immigration health surcharge since the Prime Minister said it would end, not just for himself and his wife, but twice in 6 months for his newborn baby daughter. We don't just want these medics to stay in the NHS, we need them to stay in the NHS. The new rules published this morning confirm that the charge will end, but they don't come into effect until January. So can the Minister update the House? When will the surcharge end for health and social care workers? And why does the detail published this morning suggest that some will still have to pay it, only to be reimbursed?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, in starting, the details published this morning relate to the new system beyond the 1st of January. However, to be clear, we will refund those who've paid it since the 31st of March, not just since the time when the Prime Minister made the announcement. And we expect to bring in the new health and care visa significantly before the 1st of January, and hopefully we're planning actually before the 1st of October to have it in place. And that means people will therefore, applying for that, will not have to pay the surcharge.
Number 25, sir.
We are committed to protecting places of worship from hate crime through the Places of Worship Protective Security Scheme. The funding for next year is an uplift of nearly double to £3.2 million, double the amount awarded last year. Our public consultation on providing greater protection from hate crime for places of worship closed on the 28th of June, and we're reviewing responses and will respond in due course.
John Powell.
There is a balance to be struck between worshipping openly and being provided with adequate security. Would the Minister say what success the government's Places of Worship Protective Security Funding Scheme has had in achieving that balance?
Minister Atkins.
Very Very much so. I can assure my honourable friend that the Places of Worship Protective Security Scheme has been designed so that each place of worship can apply for practical security measures that suit their individual needs, ranging from CCTV to alarm systems. This allows each place of worship to remain open and accessible for worshippers while providing greater security. We want to ensure that this scheme listens to worshippers and their communities when seeking to achieve the balance to which he rightly refers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 26.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and in particular, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for the work that she has done specifically on the whole issue of child sexual exploitation.
Yes. Sir Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful that the Home Secretary takes this topic seriously. We in Rotherham are very fortunate because we have the National Crime Agency to deal with past cases, but will she also look at cases across the country, the resources that the police forces have there, but also the local authorities who have to step in and put the child protection in place and the victim support in place? There isn't enough nationally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady is right, and in fact it's fair to say she and I go back a long way on this issue. I recall when she first came to see me in the Treasury many years ago to raise this point. And she knows as well that I've recently announced the Home Office will be publishing a paper to help us better understand characteristics associated with groups. And I would welcome and ask the Honourable Lady to work with me and join our external reference group that I have established on this important area. But, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady specifically raises issues around third-party organisations. She mentions in her own constituency, and I've met many of those survivors and sufferers directly with her on this issue. They've had a terrible time. They've also been failed by many aspects of the state and society. We can never allow that to happen again, which is why I'm committed, not just from resourcing, but also through the work that I've commissioned in the department, which I know she will join me in and support us on our work on that, but making sure that no other aspect of the state or organisation or third party or government institution turns a blind eye and ignores the needs of individuals in the way in which happened in her own constituency.
Number 27, please, Mr. Speaker.
We are firmly committed to making the UK the safest place in the world to be online. We will be publishing a full government response to the online harms white paper consultation in the autumn, and our ambition is to bring forward legislation in this session. In the meantime, the Home Office continues to engage with social media platforms on the safety of their users. We are clear that these companies need to take action now to tackle illegal harms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's been over a year since the government published its online harms white paper, and yet there is still no proper protection in place. Instead, all we've had are delays, ministerial briefings about potentially watering down the sanctions within the white paper, and continued intensive lobbying by tech giants, who, by the way, Mr. Speaker, are still failing to remove harmful content and disinformation. That really is poor. So can the Minister update the House about what conversations she has had with social media companies about taking down harmful content, and when exactly will the online harms bill finally be published?
Minister Atkins.
Well, actually, the online harms white paper was world-leading in its ambitions in terms of sorting out the online world. We're very clear what's illegal offline is also illegal online, and that has been the driving force behind our work on this white paper and on the consultation. As I say, we'll be responding to the consultation in the autumn. We are very much working at pace on this, but we should not shirk the fact that we are leading the world potentially with this work, including our work on tackling child sexual exploitation online, and we all want this abuse to stop.
Patrick Reddy.
Question 28, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to group question 28 with question 29. We remain committed to providing support and accommodation to those who need it, but in addition to that free accommodation, we also pay for utility bills, council tax, free NHS care is available to those who need it, and there is free education for those with children. In addition to that, For 3 months, starting on the 27th of March, we paused the process of asylum cessation, and in addition to that, there was a 5% increase in the cash allowance made just a few weeks ago.
Patrick Reilly.
I'm not suggesting he wouldn't give these things to people who need them, no matter what their background or where they come from. Now, he was good enough to meet with Glasgow's MPs, but the reality is that forcing over 300 vulnerable asylum seekers into hotels by the contractor mayors has really significantly damaged trust in the system. And to rebuild that trust, there has to be an independent review and lessons learned. So can he tell us what steps is he taking to make sure that review happens?
Well, he's right. 341 people were moved at the end of March from temporary service departments into hotel accommodation because the temporary service departments were considered unsuitable, bearing in mind coronavirus. He's also right that I have been meeting with Glasgow MPs and will, of course, continue to do so. I've met twice with Eileen Campbell, the Cabinet Secretary, and with the leader of Glasgow City Council, and I've committed to continue such meetings going forward, and he and I have spoken about that. There are some specific concerns which he and his colleagues have raised concerning the hotel accommodation, and I've asked officials in the Home Office to urgently look into those and to report back to me.
Heading to Motherwell to visit Marion Fellows. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The requirements in the asylum accommodation contracts to safeguard vulnerable people are absolutely vital. Yet, the recent National Audit Office report discloses that the contract fails to provide for proper monitoring of them or sanctions for breaches. Will the Minister fix that? And will he explain why there is no safeguarding framework in place yet, despite this contract being worth billions of pounds of public money?
Well, we are, of course, studying the report very carefully. We do, as you would expect, Mr. Speaker, monitor very carefully the way that the contractors operate, and where concerns are raised, as, for example, they have been in relation to Glasgow by Glasgow MPs and others, we do look into those and investigate them very seriously, and that is what we're doing in the case of Glasgow.
SNP spokesperson Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The National Audit Office report, which my honourable friend, the member for Motherwell and Wishaw, mentioned, is not just about value for money, but it's also about people. And of course, asylum seekers are, by their very nature, vulnerable people. Many of them are survivors of trafficking or ill treatment, including torture. Yet, under the existing Home Office contracts with private companies, it's possible for these private companies to shove hundreds of these asylum seekers into hotels without doing proper individual assessments of their vulnerabilities. Now, the National Audit Office report records that 10 months into these contracts, there is no safeguarding framework. So what I'd like to hear from the Minister today is, can he give us a date on which he will introduce a safeguarding framework for these private company contracts?
Well, the Honourable Lady asked about vulnerability assessments, and in fact, in the case of Glasgow that we've been discussing, there were vulnerability assessments done before people were moved, and I understand that 109 people who might have been moved from the temporary serviced accommodation into the hotels were in fact not moved as a consequence of exactly that vulnerability assessment. And the Honourable Lady made a more general point about taking care of people who are vulnerable. This country has an extraordinarily proud record. Last year, we made 20,000 grants of asylum or protection, one of the highest in Europe. We welcomed over 3,500 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the highest of any European country, and we are the only G7 country to spend 0.7% of GNI. This government in this country has an extremely proud record in this area.
I thank the Minister for his answer, but I'm sure he will recall that there was a degree of uncertainty about the nature of the assessments that were carried out in Glasgow, and I'm sure he'll agree with me that having a safeguarding framework would ensure that that sort of oversight wouldn't happen again. But he mentioned meeting with the leader of Glasgow City Council. Now, he'll be aware that many local authorities are concerned that while the Home Office is happy to pay billions to private companies under these asylum contracts, there's been no assessment of the additional demands this places on local authority resources. And local authorities are concerned that the proper financial support they need is as far away as ever. So how does he expect more local authorities to become asylum dispersal areas if the government won't give existing local authorities the support that they require?
The central government, national government, provides a huge amount of support and finance to help these asylum-seeking populations. We pay for all of the accommodation. We pay for the council tax, which of course goes to local authorities. We pay for utility bills. Those who need healthcare are treated by the NHS, and of course funding flows from central government to do that. And those requiring education are educated, and again there's a per capita funding formula to cover that. So, I mean, as far as I can see, national government is spending a huge amount of money supporting these populations. The figures, as the Honourable Lady says, run over multiple years into billions of pounds. I am always happy to talk to local authorities about the work they do and how we can work better together. That is what I'm doing already with Glasgow City Council, and via the Cabinet Secretary, 𝐼 Campbell, I hope to expand those conversations to cover other towns and cities in Scotland as well.
We're now starting with Topicals with Rob Butler.
Speaker, topical number 1, please.
4 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the British public voted to leave the EU. They voted to take back control of our borders and to end free movement. And last year, the British people voted to get Brexit done and introduce a points-based immigration system. Mr. Speaker, we are doing exactly that. But despite the best efforts of the party opposite, we are ending free movement and we are introducing a points-based system. And today we have published more details of that system, which will enable us to attract the brightest and the best. A firmer and fairer system that will take back control of our borders, crack down on foreign criminals and unleash our country's true potential, building a brighter future for Britain and signalling to the world that we are open for business.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week was the 15th anniversary of the 7/7 terrorist attacks. It was a moment once more to commemorate those who lost their lives and to repeat our appreciation for those who rushed to help those caught in those dreadful blasts, particularly from the emergency services. So could my right honourable friend update the House, please, on what plans her government has to try to prevent future such attacks, and particularly to monitor people who've raised the suspicions of the police and security services?
No, my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right to pay tribute and commemorate the anniversary of those attacks. In short, Mr. Speaker, we are constantly investing in our security and intelligence services, but also investing in counter-terrorism policing in particular. They've had an increase this year of £90 million, one of the largest uplifts ever, taking CT policing funding to over £900 million. And of course, we have to do more in terms of strengthening them, but making sure our system is fit and agile and responsive to all sorts of threats that come forward.
Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I, of course, join the Home Secretary in paying tribute to those who died in the 7/7 attacks and commend the work of the emergency services that day. Mr. Speaker, today, having read the details of the proposed new immigration system, I was disappointed, if unfortunately not shocked, to see evidence yet again that this government does not consider carers to be skilled workers, as they have been excluded from the qualifying list for the health and care visa. After the Prime Minister accused care workers of not following the guidance on COVID-19, and now this, can the Home Secretary please answer a simple question? What does the government have against care workers?
Minister Foster.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have every support for our care workers, and senior care workers will qualify under the new points-based system. And what I'd say to the honourable member is that people will look at what's happened over the last few months and think that surely the vision for the social care sector is not to carry on looking abroad to recruit at or near the minimum wage, when we need to prioritise jobs here in this country.
Thomas-Symonds.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all want more people training and entering the care sector at a decent wage. Of course we do. But the reality is there are over 100,000 vacancies in England alone today. Now, some of us in the House, Mr. Speaker, don't need reminding of how important and skilled jobs of care workers are. But that doesn't always seem to be the case for members opposite. So I'd like to extend an invitation to the Home Secretary. I will convene a meeting of a delegation of care workers to help provide a better understanding of the incredible jobs they do alongside their trade union representatives. Would the Home Secretary care to join me? I'm sure the Right Honourable Lady would find meeting frontline care workers incredibly useful when sitting there deciding how skilled people's jobs are.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think many people in Torfaen and Halifax listening to the honourable gentleman will wonder whether he's been following the news recently about, sadly, the impacts economically of COVID-19 and the number of our own UK-based workers who will need to get back into employment. So it's hard to believe that many will then believe there's a labour shortage. But we are engaging regularly with the care sector. We're listening to what they say, but our priority is that in future these jobs be valued, rewarded and trained for, not immigration be an alternative to that.
Let's head to Ludlow and visit Philip Dunn. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Environmental Audit Committee highlighted in our reports on hand car washes in 2018 and fast fashion in 2019 clear evidence of modern slavery in plain sight in hand car washes on streets across Britain and in garment factories in Leicester. Will my right honourable friend commit to do all she can to work across government agencies to rid this scourge from our towns and cities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I completely agree with my right honourable friend in terms of what he has described as a modern-day scourge when it comes to exploitation. He mentions car hand washes. Mr. Speaker, I think local authorities themselves need to do so much more in terms of stepping in and going in to investigate with trading standards. But he is right to press me and press the government on integrated working across all aspects of the state at a national government level and also at a local authority level as well. But he also mentions Leicester. He, like all honourable members of this House, will be interested to know that we have established a cross-government task force that will be on the ground in Leicester to absolutely ask the difficult questions of all institutions and organisations across Leicester with regards to this scourge that is taking place in the textile sector.
So the Select Committee, Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Select Committee has repeatedly called on the government to include care workers alongside NHS medical staff in the free visa extension for COVID-19 this year. And by refusing to do so, ministers have cost those frontline workers thousands of pounds this year. Can I ask the Home Secretary now whether her decision to exclude social care workers from the health and care visa does mean that those care workers will also have to pay the immigration surcharge up front? And if so, why is it fair for them to have to find many more thousands of pounds up front as well?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, the health and care visa, by the definition of its name, will include various areas in the care sector. But again, as I touched on to the Shadow Home Secretary, our vision for the future of the care sector is about providing rewarding opportunities to UK-based workers, not being based purely on immigration.
Fletcher.
My right honourable friend will fondly remember her visit to Clown in my constituency during the campaign and the popularity on the doorsteps for getting more police on the streets in Derbyshire. Our police are fantastic, but they need some new colleagues. Could she give us an update on that, please?
My friend is absolutely right, and if I may say so, I think in addition to more police officers in the honourable gentleman's constituency, he is equally as popular for his championing of more cops and also the excellent work that he is doing. I can confirm that across his county, Derbyshire will receive 85 officers as part of the uplift, but they've already recruited 60 new officers that will be coming to his community very, very soon.
Let's head to Manchester and visit Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to a new report from Quorum Children's Legal Centre, there are more than 900,000 eligible EEA children thought to be living in the UK, of which less than half have been granted status under the settlement scheme. Of the estimated 9,000 EEA children in the UK care system, the state with the duty of care to these vulnerable children has secured status for fewer than 500. What urgent action will the Home Secretary take on the back of these revelations to ensure that no vulnerable children are allowed to become undocumented?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already taken a range of action. We're working with local authorities who, as the honourable member touches on, has the duty to make the application for those eligible under the EUSS. We've also confirmed that we would accept late applications from those who should have had an application made on behalf of them on their behalf by their local council, and we're working with support groups as well, one of which I'm visiting tomorrow virtually.
Aaron Bell. Mr. Speaker, no one should be fearful of practising their faith anywhere, but there have been too many attacks, both at home and abroad, on all sorts of places of worship. So can I thank the Minister for the earlier answer to my friend, my honourable friend from Henley, in doubling the Places of Worship Protective Security Fund to £3.2 million, but also for the Home Office's recent consultation, which has recently closed. Does she believe that these measures put together will limit the chances of future hate crime attacks in the UK?
Absolutely right. This is valuable investment. It is appalling what we've seen in terms of the targeted attacks to places of worship. It's thoroughly unacceptable. It's that combined approach, along with law enforcement, that absolutely matters, because we want to see crimes of this nature absolutely decrease, and we want to stamp this out.
Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's over 3 months since Wendy Williams' Windrush Lessons Learned review was published. On the 23rd of June, I asked the Home Secretary when she would implement the review's 6th recommendation to accurately teach British colonial history in the Home Office to tackle institutional racism. The Windrush generation has waited too long for justice, and the government mustn't continue to drag its feet. The Home Secretary said that she would be bringing a timeline and action plan for implementing the recommendations before recesses appeared. Is that still the case?
Yes.
Right, Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, violent crime is the scourge of too many communities, and perhaps the Home Secretary will join me in paying tribute to the Police and Crime Commissioner from Thames Valley Police, who has put together a violence reduction unit working with the police and other partners to pilot early interventions into these offenders.
My friend is absolutely right, and I will pay tribute to the Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley and the emphasis that he has given, along with the police force, on violence reduction units, but actually that multi-agency way of working, so that young people and people across all communities can be supported to ensure that crime prevention is absolutely the focus, and also steering people away from crime and criminality.
Let's head to Scotland and visit Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When and why did the government U-turn on its commitment to a remote areas visa pilot, and who did it consult before making that disastrous U-turn?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear in our response to the Migration Advisory Committee report, and we'll make sure our new system is one that serves the whole of our United Kingdom.
Simon Feld.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women's Community Matters in my constituency is an amazing place that helps women and families, including those in urgent need. But they're rightly concerned about the availability of refuges locally. There's one in Kendal. If it's full, families have to go out of the area and often placements fail. We've passed a landmark piece of legislation with the Domestic Abuse Bill. Will you look again at funding and availability of these services in rural areas like mine?
And for his question, he's absolutely right, and I commend him for his work locally and for raising this very point. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I will write to him with the specifics of what we can do in his local area to provide assistance and financial help.
𝐏𝐚𝐭𝐫𝐭.
Mr. Speaker, Cleveland has the 3rd highest violent crime rate in the country and ranks 6th highest nationally for offences involving knives and sharp instruments. The most serious violence offences are also increasing at a higher rate than the national average, and that's despite the excellent work by our new Chief Constable. The government's granted £100 million to 18 police force areas, and PCCs deemed to have a significant problem with serious violence. Why hasn't Cleveland been included?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I will also join him in commending the work of his Chief Constable. Cleveland, he will know, has had a difficult few years when it comes not just to policing, and he will know the outcomes of many of the inspectorate reports as well. But when it comes to the areas of violence that he speaks about, of course, we're constantly looking at this whole area. And if there's more that we can do in terms of tackling serious violent crime, we will absolutely do that.
Andy Carter.
Speaker, my right honourable friend will know that the Peace Foundation is globally renowned for their work in supporting victims of terror incidents, most recently those affected in the Reading attacks. Their work is now at risk because of changes to their funding. Will the Home Secretary come to Warrington and meet the team there so that she can understand more about the great work that they're doing?
Speaker, first of all, let me commend my honourable friend for championing the work of the Peace Foundation. He's been in extensive dialogue with us on this, but he's right to point to the work that they do when it comes to victims of terror. And I'll be very happy to meet with him, come to Warrington and have further discussions about this.
Shannon? Not here, never know. Jonathan Gillis.
Speaker, shockingly in Kidsgrove and Talk, local police officers are unable to access the outdated CCTV due to it being stationed in a local high street store. I was pleased when residents supported my plan to have the Labour-run Kidsgrove Town Council use their extensive funds for a CCTV upgrade. Will my right honourable friend back my plan, call for an end to the dither and delay, and demand Kidsgrove Town Council back our brave Staffordshire police officers?
He's absolutely right. We must end the dither and delay, as he has outlined. And I commend him for championing the CCTV to make sure that the local council does step up and do the right thing. I'll give him every backing that he needs.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear that child victims of domestic abuse who do not enter a refuge often require extra support, which is regularly being overlooked. Can the Home Secretary please confirm what specific resources are available to those children to ensure that their needs are met?
Yes. Secretary.
If the Honourable Lady has specifics she would like to raise with me to come back to her on actual details for children. Obviously, we passed a domestic abuse bill last week in this House, and we've been very clear about the protections around children. That is absolutely right. There are many other measures that we have in place, and I'll be very happy to write to her about that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our commitment to providing sanctuary to those fleeing war, famine and disease is important to many across the UK, and especially in my constituency of Newport West. At the end of the transition period, the UK will leave the Dublin system, risking the loss of an important safe route to reunification for families. So will the Home Secretary amend the refugee family reunion rules to allow more families to safely reunite here in Britain?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We set out clearly during the passage of the immigration bill recently our plan to look at negotiating a proper agreement with the European Union for family reunification based on the fantastic record we have and that my honourable friend outlined earlier.
Mr.
Speaker, residents in Paston, Warrington and other parts of Peterborough have had to endure unauthorised encampments on public land and open spaces for many years. They've left behind rubbish, industrial waste and even human waste, costing many thousands of pounds to clear up. Will my right honourable friend agree that this is unacceptable, and will she bring forward legislation to deal with this as soon as possible?
I think my honourable friend knows my views on this subject matter quite well, having campaigned with him. I absolutely agree with him. It is thoroughly unacceptable, and he will have to wait to the autumn session of Parliament, but we will be bringing forward legislation covering this very issue.
In order to allow the safe exit of vulnerable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.